So, another important topic which we've already touched upon is this mutual relationship between power and knowledge. Power allows the extraction of knowledge about individuals, production of knowledge about individuals, and having knowledge about individuals then allows for a more efficient deployment of power over them, right? This is, in an important sense, it's a surface level. We can go one level deeper, right? So there's a certain notion which kind of goes back to David Hume and Jean-Jacques Rousseau and maybe Montesquieu, maybe even to Plato, this idea that human beings, right, we don't just exist naturally in the world, we also describe our existence in certain judgmental terms, in terms of language. Again, we're linguistic beings, Sprachlichkeit, we have linguisticality. And language is judgmental, right? So there's a certain discourse, there's a certain mode of understanding of reality. And this mode of understanding of reality has political relevance. So Foucault talks about discourse, or sometimes discursive formation. He uses the Greek word episteme. And these words function in a similar fashion to what Marx calls an ideology, right? And an ideology is a structural, systematic misrepresentation of reality. Well, I say misrepresentation, but in an important sense, it's not clear if we can ever go beyond this misrepresentation to see reality as it really is, right? So, you can go from one ideology to another ideology for Foucault. You can go from one discourse to another discourse, but you cannot stand outside the discourse and see things as they are in themselves. Think back to our lecture on Kant. Right? But in an important sense, right, I talk about how power flows through me, how language speaks through me. There's a discursive formation, like a culture, if you want. Cannot men make history, but history makes men. A discursive formation, discourse, which produces individuals such that one of them understands themselves as a policeman, another one, let's say, understands themselves as a criminal. And therefore, the policeman exercises the power over the criminal, but ultimately the notion is that, again, the power is anonymous, and it doesn't really belong to the policeman, but the policeman exercises this power. It flows through the policeman to the criminal. And this has important political implications, because, again, if we want to change society, we want to change the discourse. This is why May 1968 in France, politicization of the everyday. It's another important philosopher whom we keep mentioning, and maybe we'll discuss a bit more in the next lecture, whose name is Antonio Gramsci. And Antonio Gramsci explicitly calls this, well, Gramsci is writing before Foucault, but I want to push an analogy to Gramsci's notion of the war of position. And Gramsci talks about how within the intellectual sphere, what he calls the organic intellectuals can gradually, step by step, wage this war of position against the ideological hegemony. He talks about, of course, the proletarian intellectuals waging the war of position against the capitalist hegemony, trying to restructure, reframe the way people see the world, the way people understand themselves and the reality around them. When we discussed Kant, we talked about the categories of perception that are, categories which are due to our nature, maybe let's say biological nature. But we have also mentioned how, Kant seeks to find the necessary and inevitable categories of perception, like he imagines how space and time are somehow intrinsic, like necessary for all rational creatures of the universe, maybe. Modern science would tend to disagree, but I was talking about how philosophy after Kant seeks to find what is actually contingent, right? And especially what is culturally relevant, right? And Hegel talks about this a lot, how within different cultures we see the same action as, as different, right? So imagine seeing a particular individual in the Middle Ages as a witch, or maybe as a saint. And by and large, we don't see people as witches or saints anymore. Or let's say, see somebody as a serf, or as a lord, or as a king with the divine rights. So this is kind of knowledge, the knowledge structure, which has political implications. But similarly, we can talk about how today we see certain people as criminals. We see certain people as policemen. We see certain people as mad or insane. Or we see certain people as teachers or wise Nobel Prize winners, and this gives them power, right? So seeing individuals gives them power. But Foucault would say, in an important sense, nobody is criminal, policeman, madman, or teacher by nature. It is our present discursive formation which in some sense shows people, displays people as criminals. And Foucault, of course, in his genealogical fashion, urges us to look for the potential to see things differently. Maybe, implicit in Foucault, the same way that we don't think that witches exist anymore. Maybe, in the transformation, historical transformation, we will stop attributing criminality to people, right? So it's like change the way we see the world. Again, this politicization of the everyday. And in general, again, post-structuralism or postmodernism, which are very careless labels, probably best not to use them, but certainly Foucault has been associated with these labels, right? Within this whole movement, there's this deep attentiveness to language, especially when you see something, a particular practice, like the bourgeois nuclear family, or let's say Enlightenment progressiveness or capitalism, seeing something as inevitable, natural, or progressive, right, is value-laden. In an important sense, Foucault asks us, invites us, hermeneutics of suspicion, to suspect, like, in whose interest in this? In whose interest in this description? Or maybe like even, because in whose interest, that's an agent, right? But power, ultimately for Foucault, is structural, right? What kind of structure of power, what kind of discursive formation leads to the rise of this mode of seeing reality? Again, a deeply critical element of Foucault's analysis. And this is why I want to say that when we talk about Foucault's positive project, because there's a lot of criticism in Foucault, but where do we go from this? Again, Foucault's own politics were fairly left-wing, maybe to some extent liberal, to some extent progressive. It's like he worried, he cared deeply and actually engaged in struggles for the rights of inmates, of prisoners, for the rights of minorities in France, or let's say the rights of immigrants, right? So he cared about, broadly speaking, left-wing agenda. But on the other hand, he was not, he didn't call himself, let's say, a Marxist or a communist. And I think it's very important to understand why. Because for Foucault, there's always a danger. Like when you put on a white robe and say, I am a, Marxist, I am fighting for progress of humanity. This is always somewhat suspect, right? So I think that Foucault in general, like the rationale, the motivation behind his whole project is deeply progressive. Like he's fighting for his own liberation and for the liberation of his fellow human beings. He's trying to find ways to resist the structures of power, but at the same time, he's very cautious, he's very wary of dressing this fight in some sort of grand ideology, like like the ideology of communism, for example. Because again, there's always this problem of how an ideology of liberation can be subverted and can simply become a different form of determination.